Hi. So when the folks from the university reached out to me about 4 to 5 months ago asking for a conversation about Signal, when we spoke about this event at Signal and was wondering, is this an event that we should show up at? If we show up at, what are we going to say? What should we say that would be relevant to both the audience that's watching here in the room, but also the audience that's watching online? And we decided that we would talk about why it's possible to do technology differently. Many of you just know Signal is a messaging app that's been in the news in Germany a fair bit over the last couple of months for various reasons, and generally has been quite famous in the world for the last approximately 2 years. But there are many things about Signal that are quite different from many of our technology peers. So over the course of the next 40 minutes, I thought I'll spend some time talking about Signal, how it's structured, what the intentionality behind that structure is, and what that teaches us about how the technology ecosystem works. Talk a little bit about privacy as an ethos, why Signal was created in the first place, and why, if Signal as an organization went out to seek permission in order to exist and in order to do what it does, it would probably not be allowed to exist by most governments in the world. Then talk a little bit about what are some of the things and innovations that Signal has done that I think would be useful for the audience that's listening to this conversation, both to showcase how product development that takes place in consumer-facing applications, including ones that are as privacy-focused as Signal, ultimately end up being very heavily dependent on research and conversations that actually take place in institutions like universities. And finally, I will end with a broad open call that talks a little bit about how Signal is critical infrastructure and why, if as a society, we want our societies to evolve into being more digital first and adopt technologies, that we must treat critical infrastructure like critical infrastructure and not like we are treating it so far, which I hope at the end will also have a particular message for many of the people who are listening to this in the room and as well as virtually. So maybe to start off, Signal is actually a nonprofit. This is a fact that not many individuals know, but the benefit of us being a nonprofit is that it means that we don't have any quarterly earnings calls. We don't have venture capital investors who are breathing down our necks asking us to increase our revenue or our monthly active users, and our team is incredibly small. But all of these things were decisions that were actually made more than 12 to 15 years ago when Signal was created. So in order to maybe give you a little bit of a history of how Signal was first set up as an organization and how the decisions that were made then have played a very, very big role now in the reputation that Signal enjoys around the world. So Signal originally began as two actually separate projects, TechSecure and RedPhone. And both of these were actually created in the Arab Spring revolutions, which were taking place in the mid to late 2010s, at a point at which there was growing belief that in order to overthrow authoritarian regimes, people must be able to exercise their fundamental right to privacy and communication. Later on, both of these applications were combined into the Signal application, and the Signal Technology Foundation was ultimately set up. But the reason that it was decided that Signal would not be an organization that would take venture capital funding or take the other usual commercial models that are available in the Silicon Valley ecosystem was because we knew those models came with a choice. Those models came with not just money, but being beholden to the people who are providing that money and answering questions on their terms and building features that they might want of us. And it was very clear that if Signal were to retain its focus of collecting as little information about its users as possible, that it would have to happen outside the terms that are set by the commercial imperatives within Silicon Valley. And that's why Signal was set up as a 501c3, which is a nonprofit in the United States. Now, this model is not entirely unique. There are organizations like Wikipedia, Mozilla, which makes the Firefox browser, and a few others that are similarly structured as nonprofits. But they remain a drop in the pond of what is a very large ecosystem that is largely still driven by for-profit motives. From experience over the last 10 years, I can quite confidently tell you that being a nonprofit has allowed Signal to make difficult choices much more easily than Signal would have had to if it were governed by an alternative ecosystem, either of corporate governance or of how its financial incentives were structured. And that's the first lesson, really, that I would like to leave you all with. Structuring things in the way that focuses on their mission and on their ethos, which I will get into a bit for Signal, are often key in ensuring that they will survive in the world that often does not want them to exist, and where imperatives such as competition can often mean that if you're small and niche, it's a matter of time before you vanish. And as you will soon see, it is this non-profit structure and this ethos towards privacy as a fundamental human right that today has led to the world where over 3.5 billion people in the world today talk using the Signal protocol, something that a small organization of between 50 to 55 people maintain around the world. In order to be able to do so, our mission is obviously quite important. And Signal's mission is to make private communication accessible, secure, and ubiquitous. And I would like to focus on each of those three words to say how we actually bring that into life in the day-to-day of our products. The first is accessible. Making privacy accessible means that privacy should be available to everyone by default and as easy to use as alternatives that may not be as private. As many people in this room may remember, end-to-end encryption, or this idea that you send a message to someone or a group and only the people to whom that message was sent to could read it mathematically, is by no means a long-standing tenet in the technology sector. Today, it is soon becoming the norm. iMessage by Apple has it, WhatsApp by Meta has it. But if you turn the clock back about 10 years and you look at the ways in which this ecosystem was initially set up, end-to-end encryption was not the norm. It was the geeky, nerdy exception that you could access if you used OTR messaging or used PGP keys in order to encrypt your email, but not even the most die-hard fan would tell you that these things were simple or easy to do, and definitely not as simple or as easy as downloading an app off a Play Store, creating an account, and messaging someone. The reason that this ethos and this accessibility has been at the core tenet of Signal is because we want it to be available by default, and we want it to be the norm that pushes the rest of the technology ecosystem forward and forces others to compete with us, not just on money, not just on users, but also on privacy. And today, we live in a world where that is increasingly the case, even among some of the largest technology companies in the world. This idea of making it not just for the tech savvy, not just for the activists, not just for the journalists, but for everyone, isn't a feature just for feature's sake. It is the very reason that we exist and the reason that we've had the impact that we've had in the world around us. We're building towards a digital landscape where silence, true privacy, is respected just as much as being overt and out there. The other two terms, secure and ubiquitous. In order for communications on Signal to be secure, the idea of making it work as simply as it does was actually a mathematical problem. And one of the reasons that Signal enjoys the reputation that it does, both for security, but also for the impact that it enjoys around the world, is actually rigorous engineering accompanied by being an open source product. Signal's history is rooted in cyberpunk tradition, building on decades of cryptographic research that actually made it possible for these things to be deployed at the scale in which they were. For us, open source is not just another buzzword, and we certainly don't make our product open source only to capture developer mindshare. We do it because we believe that this means transparency. Today, the reason you can take Signal's word on making sure that things are working the way that they are is not based on taking a press release from our sentence and saying Signal says this is true. It's true because you can find this information on GitHub, online, for all of our clients, as well as the code that we run on the server side. What this means is that we are putting up an example to the technology ecosystem that doesn't just say, take our word for it, but open sourcing our code and open sourcing our product to make sure that in order for you to vet, say as a university, if you want to deploy it or not, you can just as easily give it to your technology team and ask them to validate the assumptions that we very clearly seem to make. Now, being the messaging application that is used by heads of state, by militaries, by journalists, by activists in some of the most repressive environments on earth, also means that we have many, many eyes watching the protocol, and even more eyes watching our repositories for every single change that we make. This means that we don't just have to rely on Signal's idea of what safe and secure is, but we can take the image and the impression of the entire community of security researchers that regularly validate our products. And that is the second point, which is that security should not come through obscurity. And when implemented at the scale at which Signal is, it is often better to be available and prominently available in a manner that your claims can be verified, something that is quite far from the truth for many of the organizations that are our competitors and is soon actually not becoming a norm in the technology industry with the way that artificial intelligence is being deployed. And the final piece, if you remember from the three pieces, was accessible, secure, and ubiquitous. For ubiquitous, I would actually like to talk about the Signal protocol. It's quite likely that you are using the Signal protocol today, even if you don't know so. The reason for that is that there are many messaging apps and services around the world, including services that just place phone calls with large people at an organization level, that are actually based on the Signal protocol. WhatsApp today licenses the Signal protocol from Signal and uses it to deploy it to over 3 billion devices around the world, from people's computers and mobile phones, including to, in some cases, people's televisions. The Signal protocol today secures and encrypts more than 3.5 billion people every single month because of the fact that it is the gold standard in engineering. And it became the gold standard in engineering for end-to-end encryption for a few reasons. The first was because it was created as a public good. If Signal had desired, it could have made it proprietary and decided to set up an ecosystem where a few people who ran Signal probably would have made a lot more money than they did so far. But instead, it was created as a public good, available under the GPL license for people to be able to access, that would allow them to deploy it in their product as long as they also make their product open source, encouraging a certain community to develop around the protocol. It is also possible to license the protocol outside of the terms of this open source license. One of the most common questions we get is, why do you license your protocol to Meta? Aren't you an organization that likes privacy, and Meta has the reputation that it does? But we often say that we believe that privacy is for everyone, and any move that makes it more widely available to more users for us is a better world, and therefore we will work with everyone in order to make privacy more meaningful and in order to make sure that the mathematical guarantees behind the product are as targeted and as sharp as possible. With that, I hope to have spoken to you about the ecosystem impact we've had, which is ubiquity, the security, which we get from being an open source product, as well as accessibility, which is making sure that we design our products in a way that actually works for everyone. Now, each of these three principles is one that can be interpreted in different ways by different communities. In the technology sector today, where everything is largely based on hype, and we seem to be walking back many of the gains that we've made over the last 15 to 20 years on everything from environment to privacy, it is vital to center decisions around principles that you remain true to, no matter how much the circumstances around you change. And that is the environment in which Signal finds itself today. An increasingly lone voice asking for values to be implemented in governments, as I will get to in a bit, to ensure that the fundamental right to privacy is still meaningfully available in as many places in the world as possible. And if we live in a world where educational systems and universities have to change, have to adapt to the reality of the world around them, it is quite likely taking this principled approach and making sure that they exist not just as places to train bright minds, but to create a future in which technology can actually serve as a source of social good. We believe that these values are just as important as the intensity of the knowledge or the work that is produced outside of these ecosystems. Now, to talk a little bit about innovation. What are some of the ways in which Signal stays ahead in privacy, and what are the ways in which this deeply intersects with research work that takes place well outside a technology company? I'll maybe use the first example of post-quantum cryptography. At a high level, what is widely expected to happen, some people say next year, some people say 5, some people say 10, but everyone agrees that quantum computers are here to stay. That quantum computing will allow mathematical calculations that at one point would have taken millions of years to carry out to now be carried out in manners that can take sometimes minutes or seconds because of the nature of how quantum computers work. What this enables in computing are harvest now and recap later attacks. This means that an adversary can scan encrypted content, store it, with the hope that they cannot read it today. But whenever the quantum computing capabilities are actually available, they will start reading them by applying quantum computers to the information that they have already harvested. Now, this is actually a pretty hard problem, and some of the smartest minds in cryptography have been working on this problem for the better part of the last 20 years. Recently, NIST, the standardization organization in the United States, has actually put out standards that are quantum resistant. And Signal was one of the first messaging providers to actually make parts of the Signal protocol quantum resistant, which means that for the last approximately year, certain key parts of the handshake within the Signal protocol are quantum resistant, making it much harder for these harvest now and decrypt later attacks to be carried out. Now, when Signal did this work, and this work, once again, is open source, part of the protocol, available on the GitHub repo, as well as in academic peer-reviewed papers that have been widely used by the cryptographic community, actually came from Signal's collaboration with some research organizations around the world. And this is because in cryptography, the bleeding cutting edge is not necessarily happening inside organizations. It's happening at universities and by professors who are leading experts in their field. We worked quite closely with some of them, including in labs in Europe, in order to come up with the work that we did on post-quantum cryptography. Some of the verification of this work has also been carried out by researchers in Europe and has also been peer-reviewed and academically published. This showcases how what is seemingly very simple, day-to-day messaging, can actually be made resilient to some of the most advanced form of computing threats that currently exist in the world, largely based on the work and research that takes place within universities. Now, this is by no means unique to Signal. Most large technology companies spend a lot of time and effort building relationships with between large technology companies and research universities. But the output of this work is often sometimes much more internal facing than it is in the case of Signal, thanks to its open source nature. It is clear that ever since the development of AI is taking place and has accelerated in the manner that it has, specifically generative AI in the last couple of years, that it is vital that this work continue and that open source not be vilified as something that merely extracts value, but is also looked at as a place not just of transparency, but of creating knowledge commons, which are more widely available and allow others to iterate upon the work of experts, which is one of the foundational principles of academia in general. Similarly, we've also worked on usernames and phone number privacy within Signal. For the first couple of years, if you were on Signal, you needed a person's phone number in order to be able to talk to them. As you can imagine, if someone is fighting an authoritarian regime and they get their phone confiscated, that effectively meant that everybody had the identity of everyone that person was talking to. By everybody here, and I mean everybody who was investigating that offense. In this case, however, Signal spent quite some time trying to create separate parallel identity systems that allow you to use a username, something that you can change and is alphanumeric, alongside your phone numbers, giving users a choice of privacy where they could choose to share their username with some people and phone numbers with people who they are closer to or they trust even more. This work was a multi-year project because of how small an organization we are, but was also based on some very, very interesting work around zero-knowledge proofs, another very interesting form of cryptography that allows people to be able to verify whether they know something without divulging what the thing itself is. It's also the technology that Signal uses in order to do contact matching. So Signal actually doesn't know your contact book or who you're messaging. Sometimes an analogy that we use is imagine operating a postal service without knowing what people's addresses are. People's addresses are hidden in this analogy from the postal service itself. This is actually made possible using zero-knowledge proofs, which still are a fairly cutting-edge form of cryptographic research, and another example of the ways in which a small but crucial nonprofit like Signal leverages and builds upon the work that takes place in large academic institutions and showcases work that may be taking in one part of the world can have an exponential impact even in the other part. Now that I've spoken about innovation, some of the ways in which Signal itself has worked with academia and our ethos ourselves, I'd like to go a little broader, and this is probably the piece that is both the most and the least relevant to some parts of this audience, which is what is Signal seeing around the world when it is facing the landscape of privacy, and what are some of the trends that we've been seeing. It's quite clear to us at Signal that there's a growing, palpable discomfort with pervasive surveillance and data exploitation. Organizations and individuals are waking up to the fact that fundamental rights are being debated and potentially bargained away. They're actively seeking alternatives that protect their digital autonomy. The growth we are seeing in the adoption of privacy-preserving tools is about much more than just downloading an application or taking a call. It is an indicator that society is questioning the direction it is being taken in. The people who choose to use such applications are actively choosing tools that respect their dignity in the face of often an expanding surveillance state, as well as the surveillance corporatization of their day-to-day lives. It is also telling us that the demand for genuine privacy is not only real, but is becoming a form of peaceful and powerful resistance. People are tired of being the product. They are choosing to be participants in secure, human-centric networks. Now, this premise is one that Signal has seen firsthand. Since January 2025, the number of people who've used Signal, as well as the number of new users who are coming onto the platform, has increased quite a lot in many countries around the world, including in Germany and in Europe. And for us, this is a sign that people are actually starting to question what technology they are using, who owns the technology that they are creating, and what can happen if that technology is taken away. Now, each of these three principles that I just mentioned earlier, who controls what you're doing, what will happen if it is taken away, and to what extent do you understand how it actually works, are all things that, according to us at Signal, are fundamental questions facing the technology sector today. Many individuals often talk about sovereignty, this idea that you must be in charge of the software that you run and you control. Being an open source product, it would be quite easy for us to say sovereignty is not really an important factor for Signal. Signal will be able to make these things work largely because of the fact that if you don't like Signal, you can make a copy of it, call it whatever you want, and also make it open source and make it a messaging application. But that ignores the fact that network effects are very, very important. One of the reasons why Signal is as popular as it is because it actually gives people the ability to communicate with each other outside an organizational context. For example, for the people in this room who work in this university, you probably have an internal messaging platform, a place where you can reach other students, other professors and teachers, university staff, and anyone who has an email ID or another identifier provided by this university. However, those are not the only kinds of communications that all of you perform. You often talk, as I'm sure, professor to professor, to people in other universities, people in other countries. As students, I'm sure you have friends both in this city as well as in the university ecosystem, both in Germany and in beyond, who you regularly converse with. And it is at this place that applications like Signal are really, really important, because they provide a default amount of privacy no matter who you are talking to. In 2025, when there were hearings taking place in the United States, at that point in time, the Director for National Intelligence admitted publicly in a hearing that new individuals who join the intelligence community have Signal pre-installed by default on their phones. And this is not so that they can do official classified work. This is so that every other thing that they do is also equally classified and protected to the extent that it's possible. Does this mean that this security is perfect? Obviously not. But it does mean that if one head of state wants to message another head of state, the odds are they don't want to be able to first send a message to that person and ask them to install another application or create an account. The space where you're likely to find those important people is Signal because of the default amount of privacy protections that it provides, and because the same network effects that have benefited those large platforms in the social media sense for so long are actually also quite beneficial for instances of messaging. And it is this that we believe is responsible for Signal increasingly becoming more and more popular. And this is also not just about Signal. There are many organizations around the world, Proton as an example, but also others, Malvad, a very famous VPN provider, that are also seeing their popularity increase. It's becoming clear that people want alternatives, and alternatives are starting to compete in a more meaningful way against the larger, more dominant technology platforms. And it's clear that the education community, both from a sense of making decisions that are important in order to signal to markets, but also as individuals who have the skills, resources, and time to contribute to these projects, many of whom are open source, are a vital part of ensuring that this trend broadly continues in the same positive direction it is so far. Now, I have about 13 minutes left, so I'd like to use that to talk about two pretty quick things. The first, something that has been a big part of my day-to-day life, which is what are some of the things that Signal is fighting against? So not just the things that are going well, but the things that are creating trouble for privacy, for encryption, and for many other fundamental rights. And then also talking a little bit, like I mentioned, about Signal as critical infrastructure. So essentially, Signal is regularly engaging in what we call asymmetric warfare. We are up against companies with nearly limitless resources, whose entire business models are often based and dependent upon surveillance. They set the defaults, they own the platforms, they control the app stores, and by extension, they often also control the narrative. This means that Signal cannot compete with them on money and on resources. The only way we can compete with them is our reputation. And we might do things like be an open source product to make our reputation more widely available, but the true reason that we enjoy the reputation that we do is because of actually the cybersecurity community. Hackers, malicious actors, intelligence agencies, every single one of this broad cybersecurity community plays a vital role in interrogating and challenging Signal. Some of them do it responsibly, some of them do it deeply irresponsibly. But the reality is that without the cybersecurity community, Signal would not enjoy the reputation that it does, because most people choose something by talking to people within their community or network who they trust, whose word they can take that something is true. And Signal has been the name that has been recommended for so long in the community now, largely because of that validation that can take place externally and without Signal's input. Ensuring that access to Signal does not become limited is also a key priority for us, whether it is through the asymmetric warfare against our far larger corporate competitors that I mentioned, or whether it is one because of governments who may often choose to block access to Signal, like many governments around the world choose to do. We believe that we can be the friction in this well-oiled machine of extraction of value, and return it to where it belongs, the users. There are also some legislative threats that we are facing around the world that I wanted to take a minute or two to talk about. Across the world, Signal and everybody else like us are facing direct threats to privacy. Governments are advocating for legislation that would force encrypted messaging services like ours to build backdoors, allowing authorities to access communications. Some of these are good in that They force societies to have a conversation of what do they actually want to retain and what do they not, of how they want technology to interface with well-established societal norms. But in most other cases, we actually find them quite horrifying. The most dangerous idea, which Europe is actually leading the charge in proposing, is client-side scanning. The idea that if you can't break encryption, make your computer scan everything before it is sent. Imagine if your camera scanned an image before deciding to save it or not. The UK just proposed that a filter be built to detect nudity by default right down to the camera level. Europe has proposed in the past that text, video, and audio should be scanned against an on-device database prior to being sent to determine legality or not. Apart from the deeply flawed idea that these technologies are perfect and can actually do these things, what we are actually seeing is states entering into pre-censorship. The idea that if something is prohibited from being shared, refusing to share it based on certain normative values that the state will impose upon the technology sector. We treat client-side scanning, which in Europe otherwise is known as chat control, as a very, very strong red line. We have been absolutely clear about this many times in the past. There is no such thing as a backdoor only for the good guys. Vulnerability for one is a vulnerability for all. You cannot build a secure house and then claim that handing over the key to the police is the same as locking the house up. Mathematically, it may not seem like encryption is being broken, but many of these ideas fundamentally negate the very purpose of encryption itself. Now, the reason I bring it up here is it's actually the academic community that has been at the forefront of pushing back against many of these changes. We've had hundreds of professors across Europe regularly engage with the political process and push back against this idea that client-side scanning is either acceptable or should be normalized. And in the day-to-day reality of that pushback, it is often very important for nonprofits like us, which ultimately build a product in the marketplace, to be able to rely on independent expertise, to be able to rely not on what we are saying, but on what the rest of the community itself also says. What we have always said, and something that many other national security and even intelligence agencies have agreed with, is that implementing such access mechanisms would introduce security risks that could be exploited by unauthorized parties, including hostile powers. We've also seen this happen in the United States. Not many of you may know this because it was buried in the late 2024 news cycle, but I would highly encourage you all to look up the Salt Typhoon attacks. The same vulnerabilities that were included by the United States of America in its telecom infrastructure to enable access for lawful interception were exploited, likely by Chinese nation-state attackers, in order to be able to surveil presidential candidates in the 2024 elections. This was public information. The intelligence agencies made this information public, and is one of the reasons why many of them now use Signal, because they still have not been able to say with 100% clarity that those malicious actors have left those telecommunications networks and no longer have access to this information. Our president, Meredith Whittaker, has stated Signal's position on these issues quite unequivocally. If legislation requires Signal to undermine our privacy promises by including a backdoor, we will withdraw from any market rather than comply. We will not compromise on the integrity of the technology or the safety of the millions of people who rely on Signal. It is a dangerous survival of a zombie argument that we must weaken security for everyone to supposedly create security for some. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the physics of security, and one that we are committed to fighting. The academic community has been an essential aspect of this fight, and we are quite certain that it is not going to go away anytime soon. To the final bit of the conversation, which was going to be about Signal as firstly critical infrastructure, and then a little bit about Signal and some of the threats that it's facing in what is clearly a topical conversation, including in academic circles: artificial intelligence. At Signal, we believe that the rapid and often reckless deployment of AI systems presents a drastic, almost unimaginable threat to privacy. We would usually invite people to think of examples like Microsoft Recall, a local always-on screen recording system that takes a screenshot of your screen every 3 to 5 seconds, stores it on the computer, runs a local model on it so you can ask it a question, when was I looking at a yellow car? And it'll show you the screenshot of when you were looking at a yellow car on your computer. But it also means that it has taken a screenshot of your screen every 3 to 5 seconds. Credit card information, banking information, your passwords, healthcare information, sensitive information on these computers being surveilled in order to be able to justify the massive amount of investment that is going into artificial intelligence. All of these features are often marketed for user benefit, but what they actually do is exemplify a trend towards comprehensive and inescapable digital surveillance. What Signal had to do for this was disable the ability on new Windows 11 computers that are Copilot Plus to be able to take screenshots in the application. We used digital rights management systems in order to make sure that you could not, in order to protect people's privacy. An irony that we are very deeply aware is quite ironic for an open source application to be able to rely on DRM in order to be able to protect privacy. But the sad reality of the world is that is what Microsoft forced us to do. They control the operating systems upon which we run. We are bound by the rules of the operating system and have to use the mitigation measures, which are often quite poorly thought out in order to protect the privacy of our users. Now, this example, I am sure, resonates with many of you in different ways. Some of these technologies may already be deployed in your systems, and others will soon be pushed to be deployed in your systems under the guise of convenience. However, the idea that every digital interaction should be recorded, indexed, and made searchable is a chilling prospect, and one that we should resist. AI agents that are deployed as widely as they often are, without strict privacy boundaries, become perfect tools for dragnet surveillance, and we are moving towards a world in this feature is a lot more likely than we think it is. Signal believes that it can stand up against a bulwark against this automated and intrusive erosion of our fundamental rights, but we also want to make sure that we are spreading the word and building awareness so that when these technologies appear at people's doorsteps, they can evaluate them fairly and make a decision that is in their best interests rather than the interests of the companies that are deploying them. And finally, private and secure communications should not be a luxury. They are a fundamental underpinning of a free and democratic society. They are essential for journalism, for activism, and also for many of the essential aspects of the academic community. As we have illustrated over the course of this conversation, it's quite likely that many of the principles that apply to Signal as a small, under-resourced, open source application that is often up against far better endowed organizations, academia has a lot of experience in dealing with similar odds, but yet has always been a source of inspiration and of finding places where these solutions can have the maximum impact while still making sure that knowledge is treated as a public good rather than as a proprietary asset. Similarly, Signal and tools like it should be understood and supported as critical public interest technology. In places where these fundamental rights are currently being threatened, and I would encourage you to ruminate on the fact that it might be much, much closer to home than it appears, in the highest halls of power, the role of such technology has never been more vital. We must recognize the value of organizations like Signal in resisting attempts to curtail fundamental rights, but most importantly, think about what kind of an ecosystem will allow other signals to also thrive, to allow other projects that arise out of academic institutions and beyond to be viewed not just as public goods, but as valid alternatives that can be used in order to actively target better outcomes for society. Our future depends on our ability to communicate without being surveilled by the very tools that we use. I encourage you to look into Signal as well as other organizations to figure out what are the ways in which such technologies can be created and be made more widely available to the world. Thank you.